The Man with the Twisted Lip. Mr. Whitney, brother of the late Elias Whitney, D.D., principal of Theology College of St. George's, was much addicted to opium. The habit grew upon him, as I understand, from some foolish freak when he was at college. For having read De Quincey's description of his dreams and sensations, he had drenched his tobacco in laudanum in an attempt to produce the same effects. He found, as so many have done before, that the practice is easier to attain than to get rid of, and for many years he continued to be a slave to the drug, an object of mingled horror and pity to his friends and relatives. I can see him now, with yellow, pasty face, drooping lids, and pinpoint pupils, all huddled in a chair, the wreck and ruin of a noble man. One night, it was June of '89, there came a ring to my bell, about an hour when the man gives his first yawn and glances at the clock. I sat up in my chair, my wife laid her needlework down on her lap and made a little face of disappointment. "A patient?" she said. "You have to go out." I groaned, for I was nearly come back from a weary day. We heard the door open and a few hurried words, and then quick steps into the linoleum. Our own door flew open. A lady, clad in some dark-colored stuff, with a black veil, entered the room. "You'll excuse my calling so late," she began. And then, suddenly losing her self-control, ran forward, threw her arms around my wife's neck, and sobbed in her shoulder. "I'm in so much trouble," she cried. "I do want so little help." "Why," said my wife, pulling up her veil, "it is Kate Whitney. How you have startled me, Kate. I had not any idea that you were who you were when you came in." "I didn't know what to do, and I came straight to you." That was always the way. Folk who were in grief came to my wife like birds to a lighthouse. "It was very sweet of you to come. Now, you must have some wine and water. Sit here comfortably and tell us all about it. Or should you rather that I sent James off to bed?" "No, no, no. I want the doctor's advice and him, too. It's about Isa. He's not been home for 2 days. I'm so frightened about him." It was not the first time that she had spoken to us of her husband's troubles, to me as a doctor, or to my wife as an old friend and school companion. We soothed and comforted her by such words as we could find. Did she know where her husband was? Was it possible that he could not bring him back to her? It seems that it was. She had the surest information of late he had, when the fit hit him, made use of the opium den of the farthest east of the city. Hitherto his orgies had been confirmed to one day, and he had come back, twitching and shattered, in the evening. But now the spell had been upon the 8 and 40 hours, and he lay there, doubtless among the dregs and docks, breathing in the poison or sleeping off the effects. And there he was to be found, she was sure of it, at the Bar of Gold in Upper Swandam Lane. But what was she to do? What could she, a young and timid woman, make her way into such a place and pluck her husband out from among the ruffians that surrounded him? That was the case, and of course there was but one way out of it. Might I not escort her to this place? And then, as a second thought, why should she come at all? I was Isa Whitney's medical adviser, and as such I had influence over him. I could manage it better if I were alone. I promised her my word that I would send him home in a cab within 2 hours if he were indeed at the address which she had given me. And so in 10 minutes I had left my armchair and cheery sitting-room behind me, and was speeding eastward in a hansom on a strange errand, as it seemed to be me at the time, though the future only could show how strange it was to be. But there was no great difficulty in the first stage of my adventure. Upper Swindon Lane is a vile alley lurking behind the high walls which line the north side of the river to the east of London Bridge. Between a slop shop and a gin shop, approaching a steep flight of steps leading down to the black gap in the mouth of a cave, I found the den of which I was in search. Ordering my cab to wait, I passed down the steps and more hollow into the center of the ceaseless tread of drunken feet, and by the light of flickering oil lamp by the door, I found the latch and made my way into a long, low room, thick and heavy with brown opium smoke, and traced with wooden barrels, like a forecastle of an emigrant ship. There in the gloom one could dimly catch a glimpse of bodies lying in strange, fantastic poses, bowed shoulders, bent knees, heads thrown back, and chins pointing upward, and here and there a dark, lackluster eye turned upon the newcomer. Out of the black shadows, a glimmer of little red circles of light, now bright, now faint, as the burning potion waxed and waned in the bowls of the metal pipes. The most lay silent, and some muttered to themselves, and others talked together in a strange, low, monotonous voice, the conversation coming in gushes and then suddenly trailing off into silence, each mumbling out his own thoughts and paying little heed to the words of his neighbor. At the farther end, a small brazier of burning charcoal, beside which, on a three-legged wooden stool, sat a tall, thin old man, with his jaw resting upon his two fists and his elbows upon his knees, staring into the fire. As I entered, a sallow Malay attendant came hurried up to me with a pipe and a supply of the drug, beckoning me to an empty booth. "Thank you, I have not come to stay," said I. "There is a friend of mine here, Mr. Isla Whitley, and I wish to speak with him." There was a moment and an exclamation from my right. Peering through the gloom, I saw Whitney, pale, haggard, and unkempt, staring out at me. "My God, it's Watson," he said. He was a pitiable state of reaction, with every nerve in a twitter. "I say, Watson, what time is it?" "Nearly 11. "Of what day?" "Of Friday, June 19th. "Good heavens, I thought it was Wednesday." "It is Wednesday." "What did you do to frighten a chap for?" He sank his face into his arms and began to sob in a high treble key. "I tell you that it isn't Friday, man. Your wife has been waiting for this 2 days for you, and you should be ashamed of yourself." "So I am. But you've got mixed, Watson, for I have only been here a few hours. 3 pipes, 4 pipes, forget how many. But I'll go home with you. I wouldn't frighten Kate, poor little Kate. Give me your hand. Have you a cab?" "Yes, I have one waiting." "Then I shall go in it. But I must owe something. Find me what I owe, Watson. I am all off color. I can do nothing for myself." I walked down the narrow passage between the dual rows of sleepers, holding my breath to keep out the vile, stupefying fumes of the drug, and looking about for the manager. As I passed the tall man who sat in the brazier, I felt sudden pluck at my shirt, and a low voice whispered, "Walk past me and look back at me." The words fell quite distinctly upon my ear. I glanced down. They could have only come from the old man at my side, and yet he sat in as absorbed as ever. Very thin, very wrinkled, bent with age, an opium pipe dangling down between his knees, as though it had been dropped in a sheer lassitude of his fingers. I took 2 steps forward and looked back. It took all my self-control to prevent me from breaking out into a cry of astonishment. He had turned his back so that none could see him but I. His form had filled out, his wrinkles were gone, the dull eyes had regained their fire, and there, Sitting by the fire and grinning at my surprise was none other than Sherlock Holmes. He made a slight motion to me to approach him, and instantly, as he turned his face round to the room and company again, subsided into a doddering, loose-lipped senility. "Holmes," I whispered, "what on earth are you doing in this den?" "As low as you can," he answered. "I have excellent ears. If you would want to have the great kindness to rid of that sottish friend of yours, I should be exceedingly glad to have a little talk with you." "I have a cab outside." "Then pray send him home in it. You may safely trust him, for he appears to be too limp to get into any mischief. I should recommend you also send a note to his cabman, to your wife, to say that you have thrown in your lot with me. If you will wait outside, I shall be with you in 5 minutes." It was difficult to refuse any of Sherlock Holmes's requests, and they were always exceedingly diffident, and put forward in such a quiet air of mastery. I felt, however, that when Whitney was once confined to the cab of my mission was practically accomplished, and for the rest I could not wish anything better than to be associated with my friend in one of those singular adventures which were the normal condition of his existence. In a few minutes I had written the note, paid Whitney's bill, and led him out to the cab, and seen him driven through the darkness. In a very short time a decrepit figure had emerged from the opium den, and I was walking down the street with Sherlock Holmes. For 2 streets he shuffled along with a bent back and with uncertain foot. Then, glancing around quickly, he straightened himself out and burst into a heavy fit of laughter. "I suppose, Watson," he said, "that you can imagine me to be opium-addled and cocaine injections, and all other little weaknesses on which you have favored me with your medical views." "I was certainly surprised to find you there, but no more so than I of you. I came to find a friend, and I to find an enemy." "An enemy?" "Yes, one of my natural enemies, or shall I say my natural prey. Briefly, Watson, I am in the midst of a very remarkable inquiry, and I have hoped to find a clue in the incoherent ramblings of these sots, and I have done before now. Had I been recognized in that den, my life would have not been worth an hour's purchase, for I have used it before now for my own purpose, and the rascal who runs it has sworn to have vengeance upon me. There's a trapdoor at the back of the building, near the corner of Paul's Wharf, which could tell some strange tales of what has passed through it on the moonless nights." "And what do you mean, bodies?" "Ah, Watson, we would be rich men if we had £1,000 for every poor devil who has been done to death down that den. It is the vilest murder trap in the whole riverside, and I fear that Neville St. Clair has entered it, never to leave it more. But our trap should be here." He put his 2 forefingers between his teeth and whistled shrilly, a signal which was answered by a similar whistle from a distance, followed shortly by the rattle of wheels and the clink of horses' hoofs. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, and a tall dog-cart dashed up to the gloom, throwing 2 golden tunnels of light into our lanterns. "You'll come with me, won't you?" "If I can be of use." "Oh, a trusty comrade is always of use, and a chronicler still more so. My room at the Cedars is double-bedded one." "Cedars?" "Yes, that is Mr. St. Clair's house. I am staying there while he conducts my inquiry." "Where is it, then?" "Near Lee, in Kent. We have a 7-mile drive before us." "But I'm all in the dark." "Of course you are. John, you'll know better presently. Jump in here. All right, John. We shall need you. Or not need you. Here's £50. Look for me tomorrow about 11. Give her head. And so long, then." He flicked the horse with his whip, and we dashed away through the endless succession of somber and deserted streets, which widened gradually until we were flying across a broad balustrade bridge, with the murky river flowing sluggishly beneath us. Beyond lay another dull wilderness of bricks and mortar, and its silence broken only by a heavy, regular footfall of the policeman, or the songs and shouts of some belated party of revellers. A dull rack was drifting slowly across the sky, and a star or two twinkled dimly there through the rifts of the clouds. Holmes drove in silence, with his head sunk upon his breast, with the air of a man who was lost in thought, while I sat beside him, curious to learn who this new quest might be seemed to tax his power so sorely. And yet, afraid to break upon the current of his thoughts, we had driven several miles, and were beginning to get to the fringe of the belt of the suburban villas, when he stood and shook himself. Shrugging his shoulders, he lit up his pipe in the air with a man who was satisfied himself that he was acting for the best. "You have a grand drift of silence, Watson," he said. "It makes you quite invaluable as a companion. Upon my word, it is a great thing for me to have someone to talk to, for my own thoughts are not over-pleasant. I was wondering what I should say to this little dear woman tonight when she meets me at the door." "You forget that I know nothing about it." "I shall just have time to tell you the facts of the case before we get to Lee. It seems absurdly simple, and yet somehow I can get nothing to go upon. There's plenty of thread, no doubt, but I can't get to the end of it into my hand. Now, I'll state the case clearly and concisely to you, Watson, and maybe you can see a spark where all is dark to me." "Proceed, then." "Some years ago, to be definite, May 1884, there came to Lee a gentleman, Neville St. Clair by name, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely, lived generally in a good style. By degrees he made friends in the neighborhood, and in 1887 he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he now has 2 children. He had an occupation, but was interested in several companies, and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. St. Clair is now 37 years of age, is a man of temperate habits, a good husband, and a very affectionate father, and a man who is popular with all who know him. I may add that his whole debts at the present moment, so far as we have been able to ascertain, the amount of £88 10 sterling, and while he has £220 standing to his credit in the capital and county's bank. There is no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles have been weighing upon his mind. Last Monday, Mr. Neville St. Clair went into town rather earlier than usual, remarking before he started that he had 2 important commissions to perform, and that he would bring his little boy home in a box of bricks. Now, by the merest chance, the wife received a telegram upon the same Monday, very shortly after his departure, to the effect that a small parcel of considerable value, which she has been expecting, was waiting for her at the offices of Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you are all well up in your London, you will know that the office of the company is in Fresno Street, which branches out to Upper Swandam Lane, where you found me tonight. Mrs. St. Clair had her lunch, started for the city, did some shopping, proceeded to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself exactly at 4:35 walking through Swandam Lane on her way back to the station. Have you followed me so far? It is quite clear. If you remember, Monday was an exceedingly hot day, and Mrs. St. Clair walked slowly, glancing about in the hopes of seeing a cab, as she did not like the neighborhood in which she found herself. While she was walking in this way down Swandam Lane, she suddenly heard an ejaculation or cry, and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her, and it seemed to her beckoning to her from the second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she describes as being terribly agitated. He waved his hands frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been plucked back by some irresistible force from behind. One singular point which struck her, quite feminine eyes, was that although he wore some dark coat, as he was stated to in town, he had neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss with him, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which you found me tonight, and running through the front, she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met with the muscular scoundrel from whom I have spoken, who thrust her back and, aided by Dane, who acts as an assistant there, pushed her out into the street. Filled with the most maddening doubts and fears, she rushed down the lane and, by rare good fortune, met in Fresno Street a number of constables with an inspector all their way down from the beat. The inspector and 2 men accompanied her back, and in spite of the continued resistance from the proprietor, they made their way into the room in which Mr. St. Clair had last been seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, in the whole of the floor there was no one to be found, save a crippled wretch with hideous aspect, who, it seems, made his home there. Both he and the lascar stoutly swore that no one had been in the front room during the afternoon. So determined at their denial that the inspector was staggered, and had almost come to believe that Mrs. St. Clair had been deluded when, at a cry, she sprang at a small deal box which lay on the table, and tore the lid from it. Out of there fell a cascade of children's bricks. It was a toy which he had promised to bring home. This discovery, and the evident confusion which the crippled showed, made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined, and results all pointed in the abominable crime. The front room was plainly furnished as a sitting room, and led into a small bedroom, which looked out upon the back of one of the wharves. Between the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow strip, which is dry at low tide, but is covered at high tide, with at least 4.5 feet of water. The bedroom window was a broad one, and opened from below. On examination, traces of blood were to be seen on the window-sill, and several scattered drops were visible on the wooden floor of the bedroom. Thrust away behind the curtain in the front room were all the clothes of Mr. Neville St. Clair, with the exception of his coat. His boots, his socks, his hat, and his watch were all there. There were no signs of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. Neville St. Clair. At the window he must have apparently gone, and for no exit other than that was discovered, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide was at its very highest at the moment of the tragedy. And now, as the villains who seemed to be eminently implicated in the matter, the lascar was known to be a man of the vilest antecedents, but as, by Mrs. St. Clair's story, he was known to have been at the foot of the stair within the very few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window, he could hardly have been more than an accessory to the crime. His defense was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge of the doings of Hugh Boone, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way the presence of the missing gentleman's clothes. So much for the Lancaster manager. Now for the sinister cripple who lives on the second floor in the opium den, who was certainly the last human being whose eyes rested upon Neville St. Clair. His name is Hugh Boone, and his hideous face is one familiar to every man who goes into the city. He is a professional beggar, though in order to avoid the police regulations, he pretends to be a small trade in wax vistas. Some little distance down Threadneedle Street, upon the left-hand side, there is, as you may have remarked, a small angle in the wall. Here it is that the creature takes his daily seat, cross-legged, with his tiny stock of matches on his lap, and as he is a piteous spectacle, a small rain of charity descends upon his greasy leather hat, which lies upon the pavement beside him. I have watched the fellow more than once before, though I have ever seen painstaking professional acquaintance, and I have surprised at the harvests which he has reaped in a short time. His appearance, you see, is so remarkable that no one can pass him without observing him. The shock of orange hair, a pale face disfigured by a horrible scar, which, by its contradiction, has turned up the outer edge of his upper lip, a bulldog chin, and a pair of very penetrating dark eyes, which present a singular contrast to the color of his hair. All mark him out in front amid the crowd of mendicants, and so, too, does his wit, for he is ever ready with a reply to any piece of chaff which may be thrown at him by passers-by. This is a man whom we now learn to have been a lodger of the opium den, and to have been the last man to see the gentleman of whom we are in quest. But a cripple, I said. What could he have done as a single-handed man against the prime of his life? He is a cripple in the sense that he walks with a limp, but in other aspects he appears to be a powerful and well-nurtured man. Surely your medical experience would tell you, Watson, that the weakness of one limb is often compensated for by exceptional strength in the others. Pray, continue your narrative. Mrs. St. Clair had fainted at the sight of the blood upon the window, and she was escorted home in a cab by the police, as her presence could be of no help to them in their investigation. Inspector Barton, who had charge of the case, made a very careful examination of the premises, but without finding anything which drew any light into the matter. One mistake had not been made in not arresting Boone instantly, as he was allowed some few minutes, during which he might have communicated with his friend the Lascar, but this fault was soon remedied, and he was seized and searched, without anything being found which could incriminate him. There were, it is true, some bloodstains upon his right sleeve shirt, but he pointed to his ring finger, which had been cut near the nail, and explained that bleeding had come from there, adding that he had been to the window not long before, and the stains which were observed there caused doubtless the same source. He denied strenuously having ever seen Mr. Neville St. Clair, and swore that the presence of the clothes in his room was as much a mystery to him as it was to the police. As to Mrs. St. Clair's assertion that she had initially seen her husband at the window, he declared that she must have either been mad or dreaming. He was removed, loudly protesting, to the police station, while the inspector remained upon the premises in the hope of ebbing tide might afford some fresh clue. And it did, though they hardly found upon the mud bank, which they had feared to find, it was Neville St. Clair's coat, not Neville St. Clair, which lay uncovered by the tide receded. But what do you think they found in the pockets? I cannot imagine. No, I didn't think you might guess. Every pocket stuffed with pennies and halfpennies, 421 pennies and 270 halfpennies. It was no wonder that it had not been swept away by the tide, but a human body in a different matter. There is a fierce eddy between the wharf and the house. It seems likely enough that the weighted coat had remained when stripped of the body, had been sucked away into the river. But I understand that all the other clothes were found in the room. Would the body be dressed in the coat alone? No, sir. But the facts might be suspicious enough. Suppose that this man Boone had thrust Neville St. Clair through the window. There is no human eye which could have seen it. what would he do then? It would, of course, be instantly strike him that he must get rid of the telltale garments. He would seize the coat, then, and in the act of throwing it out, then it would occur to him that he could not swim or sink. He has little time, for he has heard the scuffle downstairs, and the wife has forced her way up. And perhaps he was already heard the Lascar confederate to the police that hurried up the street. There is not an instant to be lost. He rushes to some secret board where he has accumulated the fruits of his beggary. He stuffs all the coins upon which he can lay his hands on the pockets to make sure that the coat's sinking. He throws it out, and would have done the same with the other garments had he not heard the rush of steps. Only just time to close the window when the police had arrived. Well, it certainly sounds feasible. Well, we will take it to the working hypothesis to warrant of a better. Boone, as I have told you, was arrested and taken into the situation. But it could not be shown that there had ever been before anything against him. He had for years been known as a professional beggar, but his life appeared to have been one that was very quiet and innocent. There are the matter stands at present, and the questions which have to be solved. What Neville St. Clair was doing in the opium den, what happened to him when he was there, where he is now, and what Hugh Boone had done to his disappearance, as all are within solution of ever. I confess that I cannot recall any case within my experience which looked at first glance so simple, and yet which presented such difficulties. Well, Holmes has been detailing a singular series of events. We had been whirling through the outskirts of the great town until the last straggling houses had been left behind, and we rattled along the country hedge upon the other side of us. Just as he finished, however, we drove through two scattered villages where a few lights still glimmered in the windows. "We're on the outskirts of Lee," said my companion. "We have touched on 3 English countries in our short drive, starting in Middlesex, passing over an angle of Surrey, and ending in Kent. See that light among the trees? That is the Cedars, and the bedside lamp sits a woman whose anxious ears have already, I have little doubt, caught the clink of our horses' feet." "But why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street?" I asked. "Because there are many inquiries which must be made out here. Mrs. St. Clair has most kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal, and you may rest assured that she will have nothing but a welcome from my friend and colleague. I hate to meet her, Watson, when I have no news of her husband. Here we are. Whoa there." We pulled up in front of a large villa which stood within its own grounds. The stable boy had run out to the horse's head, and springing down, followed Holmes up to the small, winding gravel drive which led to the house. As we approached, the door flew open, and a little blonde woman stood in the opening, clad in some sort of light mousseline dessert, with a touch of fluffy pink chiffon around the neck and wrists. She stood with her figure outlined against the flood of light, one hand upon the door, the other half raised in her eagerness. Her body slightly bent, her head and face protruded, with eager eyes and parted lips, a standing question. "Well," she cried, "well?" And then, seeing that there were 2 of us, she gave a cry of hope, which sank into a groan as she saw that my companion shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. "No good news?" "None." "No bad?" "No." "Thank God for that. But come in, you must be weary. You have had a long day." "This is my friend, Dr. Watson. He has been my most vital use of me in several cases, and a lucky chance has made it possible for me to bring him out and associate him with this investigation." "I'm delighted to see you," she said, pressing my hand warmly. "You will, I am sure, forgive anything that may be wanting in our arrangements, when you consider the blow which has come so suddenly upon us." "My dear madam," I said, "I am an old campaigner, and if I were not... I can very well see no apologies needed. If I can be of any assistance, whether to you or to my friend here, I shall indeed be happy. Now, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, said the lady as we entered a well-lit dining room, upon the table which a cold supper had been laid out. I should very much like to ask you one or two questions, to which I beg that you'll give a plain answer. Certainly, madam. Do not trouble my feelings. I'm not hysterical nor given to fainting. I simply wish to hear your real opinion. Upon what point? In your heart of hearts, do you think the devil is alive? Sherlock Holmes seemed to be embarrassed by the question. Frankly now. Frankly now, she repeated, standing upon the rug and looking keenly down on him as he leaned back on the basket chair. Frankly, madam, I do not. Do you think that he is dead? I do. Murdered? I don't say that, perhaps. And on what day did he meet his death? On Monday. Hey, it's Silversayo. Welcome in. Perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you will do good enough to explain how it is that I received a letter from him today. Sherlock Holmes sprang from his chair as if he had been galvanized. What? He roared. Yes, today. She stood smiling, holding up a little piece of paper in the air. May I see? Certainly. He snatched it from her in his eagerness, and smoothing it out on the table, drew over the lamp and examined it intently. I had left my chair and was gazing at it over his shoulder. The envelope was a very coarse one, and was stamped with a Gravesend postmark, and with a date of that very day, or rather of the day before, for it was considerably after midnight. Coarse writing, murmured Holmes. Surely this is not your husband's writing, ma'am? No, but the enclosure is. I perceive also that whoever addressed this envelope had to go and inquire as to the address. How can you tell that? The name, you see, is in perfectly black ink, which has dried itself. The rest of it is in a grayish color, which shows the blotting paper has been used. If it had been written straight off, and then blotted, none of it would be a deep blackened shade. This man has written the name, and then has been a pause before he wrote the address, which can only mean that he is not familiar with it. It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as a trifle. Let us now see the letter. Ha! There has been an enclosure here. Yes, there was a ring, a signet ring. And you are sure that it is your husband's hand? One of his hands. One? His hand when he wrote hurriedly. It is very unlike his usual writing, and yet I know it well. Dearest, do not be frightened. All will come well. There is a huge error which is made by some little time to rectify. Wait in patience, Neville. Written in pencil upon the fly-leaf of a book, octavo size, no watermark. Posted today in Gravesend by a man with dirty thumb. Ha! And the flap has been gummed. If I am not very much in error, by a person who has been chewing tobacco. And you have no doubt that it's your husband's hand, madam? No, never heard those words. And they were posted today in Gravesend. Oh, Miss Sinclair, the clouds have lightened, though I should not venture to say that the danger is over. But he must be alive, Mr. Holmes. Unless this is a very clever forgery to be put upon the wrong scent. The ring, after all, proves nothing. It may have been taken from him. No, no. It, it is. It's very odd writing. Very well. It may be, however, have been written on Monday and only posted today. That is possible. If so, much may have happened between. Oh, do not discourage me, Mr. Holmes. I know that is all well with him. There is so keenly a sympathy between us that I should know if evil came upon him. On the very day I saw him last, he cut himself in the bedroom, and yet I was in the dining room, rushed upstairs instantly with the utmost certainty that something had happened. Do you think that I would respond to such a trifle and be yet ignorant of his death? I have seen too much to know that the impression of a woman may be more valuable than the conclusion of an analytical reasoner. And in this letter you certainly have a very strong piece of evidence to corroborate your view. But if your husband is alive and able to write letters, why should he remain away from you? I cannot imagine. It's unthinkable. And on Monday he made no remarks before leaving you? No. And you were surprised to see him in Sando Lane? Very much so. Was the window open? Yes. Then he might have called to you. He might. He only, as I understand, gave an inarticulate cry? Yes. A call for help, you thought? Yes, he waved his hands. But it might have been a cry of surprise, astonishment at an unexpected sight you might cause him to throw up his hands. It is possible. And you thought he was pulled back? He disappeared so suddenly. He might have leaped back. Did you not see anyone else in the room? No, but this horrible man confessed to having been there, and the Lascar was at the foot of the stairs. Quite so. Your husband, as far as you could see, had his ordinary clothes on. But without his collar or tie, I distinctly saw his bare throat. Had he ever been to Swandam Lane? No. Had he ever shown any signs of having taken opium? Never. Thank you, Mrs. St. Clair. Those are the principal points which I wished to make absolutely clear. We shall now have a little supper and then retire, for we may have a very busy day tomorrow. A large and comfortable double bedroom had been placed at our disposal. I was quickly between the sheets, for I was very weary after my night of adventure. Sherlock Holmes was a man, however, who, when he had an unsolved problem upon his mind, would go for days or even a week without rest, turning it over, rearranging his facts, looking at it from every point of view until he had fathomed it rather, or convinced himself that his data was insufficient. It was soon evident to me that he was now preparing for an all-night sitting. He took off his coat and waistcoat and put on a large blue dressing gown, and was wandering about the room collecting pillows from his bed and the cushions of the sofa and armchairs. With these he constructed a sort of eastern chavand, upon which he perched himself cross-legged, with an ounce of shag tobacco and a box of matches laid in front of him. In the dim light of the lamp I saw him sitting there, an old briar pipe between his lips, his eyes fixed vacantly upon the corner of the ceiling. The blue smoke curling up from him, silence, motionless, with the light shining upon his strong-set, aquiline features. So he sat as I dropped to sleep. So he sat when a sudden ejaculation caused me to wake up, and I found the summer sun shining in the apartment. The pipe was still between his lips, the smoke still curled upward, and the room was full of the dense tobacco haze, but nothing remained as a heap of shag which I had seen upon the previous night. "Awake, Watson?" he asked. "Yes." "Game for a morning drive?" "Certainly." "Then dress. No one is stirring yet, but I know where the stable boy sleeps, and we shall soon have a trap out." He chuckled to himself as he spoke. His eyes twinkled, and he seemed a different man to the sombre thinker of the previous night. As I dressed, I glanced at my watch. It was no wonder that no one was stirring. It was 25 minutes past 4. I had hardly finished when Holmes returned with the news that the boy was putting on the horse. "I want to test a little theory of mine," he said, pulling on his boots. "I think, Watson, that you are now standing in the presence of one of the most absolute fools of Europe. I deserve to be kicked from here to Charing-Cross, but I think I have the key to the affair now." "And where is it?" I asked, smiling. "In the bathroom," he answered. "Oh, yes, I'm not joking." He continued looking incredulity. "I've just been there, and I have taken it out, and I have got it in this Gladstone bag. Come on, my boy, and we shall see whether it will fit into lock." We made our way downstairs as quietly as possible and out into the bright morning sunshine. On the road stood our horse and trap, with the half-clad stable-boy waiting at the head. We both sprang in, and away we dashed to the London road. A few country carts were stirring, bearing the vegetables to the metropolis, but the lines of villas on either side were silent and as lifeless as some city in a dream. "It has been some points of a singular case," said Holmes, flicking the horse into a gallop. "I confess that I have been as blind as a mole, but it is better to learn wisdom late than to never learn it at all." In the town, earliest risers were just beginning to look sleepily from their windows as we drove through the streets of Surrey. Passing down the Waterloo Bridge Road, we crossed over the river, and dashing up Wellington Street, we wheeled sharply to the right and found ourselves at Bow Street. Sherlock Holmes was well known by the force, and the two constables at the door saluted him. One of them held the horse's lead, while the other led us in. "Who's on duty?" asked Holmes. "Inspector Bradstreet, sir." "Ah, Bradstreet, how are you?" Tall, stout official had come down the stone-flagged passage with a peaked cap and fog jacket. "I wish to have a quiet word with you, Bradstreet." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Step into my room here." It was a small office-like room with a huge ledger upon the table and a telephone projecting from the wall. The inspector sat down at his desk. "What can I do for you, Holmes?" I called about that beggar man, Boone, the one who was charged with being concerned with the disappearance of Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee." "Yes, he was brought up and remanded from further inquiries." "So I heard. You have him here?" "In the cells." "Is he quiet?" "Oh, he gives no trouble. But he is a dirty scoundrel." "Dirty?" "Yes, it is all we can do to make him wash his hands and his face with the black as a tinker's. Well, when once his case has been sold, he will be a regular prison bath. And I think, if you saw him, you would agree with me that he needed it." "I should like to see him very much." "Would you? That's easily done. Come this way. You can leave your bag." "No, I think that I'll take it." "Very good. Oh, come this way, then, if you please." He led us down a passage and opened a barred door, passed down a winding stair, and brought us to a whitewashed corridor with a line of doors on each side. "The third on the right is his," said the inspector. "Here it is." He quietly shot back a panel of the upper part of the door and glanced through. "He's asleep," he said. "You can see him very well." We both put our eyes to the grating. The prisoner lay with his face towards us in a very deep sleep, breathing slowly and heavily. He was a middle-sized man, coarsely clad, as becoming his calling, with a coloured shirt protruding through the rent of his tattered coat. It was, as the inspector said, extremely dirty, but the grime which covered his face could not conceal his repulsive ugliness. A broad wheal from an old scar ran across it from his eye to his chin, and by the contradiction had turned up on one side the upper lip, so that 3 teeth were exposed in a perpetual snarl. A hair grew low over the eyes and the forehead. "He's a beauty, isn't he?" said the inspector. "He certainly needs a wash," remarked Holmes. I had an idea that he might, and I took the liberty of bringing my tools with me. He opened the Gladstone bag as he spoke, and took out, to my astonishment, a very large bath sponge. "You're a funny one," chuckled the inspector. "Now, if you will have the goodness to open that door very quietly, we will soon make a cut of much more respectable figure." "I don't know why not," said the inspector. "It doesn't look like a credit of Bow Street cells, does he?" He slipped his key into the lock, and we all very quietly entered the cell. The sleeper half turned and settled down once more into a deep slumber. Holmes stooped to the water jug, moistened his sponge, and then rubbed it twice vigorously across and down the prisoner's face. "Let me introduce you," he shouted, "to Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee, in the county of Kent." Never in my life had I seen such a sight. The man's face peeled off under the sponge like the bark from a tree. Gone was the coarse brown tint. Gone, too, was the horrid scar which had seemed to cross, and the twisted lip which had given the repulsive snare to the face. A twitch brought away by tangled red hair, and there, still sitting up in his bed, was a pale, sad-faced, refined-looking man, black-haired and smooth-skinned, rubbing his eyes and staring about him in the sleepy bewilderment. Then, suddenly realizing his exposure, he broke into a scream and threw himself down on his face of his pillow. "Good heavens!" cried the inspector. "It is indeed the missing man. I know him from the photograph." The prisoner turned with the reckless air of a man who abandons himself to his destiny. "Be it so," he said. "And pray, what am I charged with?" "With making away with Mr. Neville St. Oh, come, you can't be charged with that unless they make you attempted suicide of it," said the inspector with a grin. "Well, I've been 27 years in the force, and this really takes the cake. If I am Mr. Neville St. Clair, then it is obvious that no crime has been committed, and that, therefore, I am illegally detained." "No crime, but a very great error has been committed," said Holmes. "You would have done better to have trusted your wife." "It was not the wife, it was the children," groaned the prisoner. "God help me, I would not have them ashamed of their father. My God, what an exposure! And what can I do?" Sherlock Holmes sat down beside him on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder. "If you leave it to a court of law to clear up the matter," he said, "of course you can hardly avoid publicity. On the other hand, if you convince the police authorities that there is no possible case against you, I do not know that there is any reason that the details should find their way to the papers. Inspector Broadstreet would, I am sure, make notes of anything that you might tell him and submit it to the proper authorities. The case then would never go into court at all." "God bless you," cried the prisoner passionately. "I could have endured imprisonment, aye, even execution, rather than to have left my miserable secrets as a family blot to my children." "You are the first who have heard my story. My father was schoolmaster in Chesterfield, where I was received in excellent condition. I travelled in my youth, took to the stage, and finally became a reporter in the evening paper of London. One day my editor wished a series of articles upon begging in the metropolis, and I volunteered to supply them. There was the point from which all my adventures started. I was only trying begging as an amateur, and I could get the facts upon which I had to base my articles. When an actor, I had, of course, learned all the secrets of making up, and had been famous in the green room for my skill. I took advantage of my attainments. I painted my face to make myself look as pitiable as possible, and made a good scar. and fixed my side with the lip with twists of the aid of a small slip of flesh-colored plaster. Then, with the red head of hair and an appropriate dress, I took my station in the business part of the city, ostensibly as a match seller, but really as a beggar. For 7 hours I plied my trade, and when I returned home in the evening, I found to my surprise that I had received no less than 26 silver and 5 dough. I wrote my articles, and though little more than that then, sometime later I backed the bill for a friend, and had a writ served upon me for £25. I was at wit's end when it came to money, but a sudden idea came to me. I begged a fortnight's grace from the creditor, asked for a holiday from my employers, and spent the time in begging the city under my disguise. In 10 days I had the money and had paid my debt. Well, you can imagine how hard it was to settle down arduous work of £2 a week when I knew I could earn as much pay in a day by smearing my face with a little paint, laying my cap on the ground, and sitting still. It was a long fight between my pride and the money, but the dollars won at last. I threw up my reporting and sat down day after day in the corner which I had first chosen, and sparing pity in my ghastly face and filling my pockets with coppers. Only one man knew my secret. He was the keeper of the low den which I had used to lodge in Swandam Lane, where I could every morning emerge from the squalid beggar and the evenings transform myself into a well-dressed man about town. This fellow, Alasker, was well paid by me for his rooms, so that I knew my secret was safe in his possession. Well, as soon as I found out I was saving considerable sums of money, I did not mean that any beggar in the streets of London can earn £700 a year, which is less than my average takings. But I had exceptional advantages in my power of making up, and also the facility of repartee, which improved my practice and made me a quite recognizable character in the city. All day a stream of pennies, varied by silver, poured in upon me, and a very bad day in which I failed to make £2. As I grew richer, I grew more ambitious. I took a house in the country, eventually married, without anyone having any suspicion of my real occupation. My dear wife knew that I had a business in the city. She little knew what. Last Monday I had finished for the day and was dressing my room above the opium den when I looked out of the window and saw, to my horror and astonishment, that my wife was standing in the street, with her eyes fixed full upon me. I gave a cry of surprise, threw up my arms to cover my face, and, rushing to my confidant, Alasker, entreated him to prevent anyone from coming up to me. I heard her voice downstairs, but I knew that she could not ascend. Swiftly I threw off my clothes, pulled on those of the beggar, and put my pigments in wigs. Even my wife's eyes could not pierce to complete the disguise. But then it occurred to me that there might be a search of the room, and that the clothes might betray me. I threw open the window, reopening it with violence the small cuts which I had inflicted upon myself in the bedroom that morning. Then I seized my coat, which had weighed down by coppers, which I had just transferred from the leather bag which I had carried my takings. I hurled it out the window and disappeared into the Thames. The other clothes would have been followed, but at that moment there was a rush of constables in the stair, and a few minutes later I confess to my relief, instead of being identified by Miss Noble at St. Clair, I was arrested as his murderer. I do not know if there is anything else for me to explain. I was determined to preserve my disguise as long as possible, and hence my preference for a dirty face. Knowing that my wife would be terribly anxious, I slipped off my ring and confided it to Lasker at the moment when no constable was watching me, together with a hurried scrawl, telling her that she was in no cause to fear. "That note only reached us today," said Holmes. "Good God, what a week she must have spent!" "The police have watched Alaska," said Inspector Bradstreet, "and I can quite understand that he might find it difficult to post a letter unobserved. Probably he handed it to some sailor customer of hers, who forgot all about it for some days." "That was it," said said Holmes, nodding approvingly. I have no doubt of it. But have you never been prosecuted for begging? Many times. But what is a fine to me? It must stop there, however, said Broadstreet. If the police are so to hush things up, there must be no more high boon. I have sworn it is the most almost which a man can take. In that case, I think it must be probable that no further steps be taken. But if you are found again, after all of it must come out, I'm sure, Mr. Holmes, that we are very much indebted to you for clearing up the matter, which I wish I knew had reached results. I reached this one, said my friend, by sitting upon 5 pillows and consuming an ounce of shag. I think, Watson, if we had better drive to Baker Street, we shall be just in time for breakfast.